Continue. All righty. Okay, for some reason, I am not seeing myself on the screen, but I'm going to go on and start the presentation. Good afternoon, and welcome to AARP Tuesday Explorers, a series of lifelong learning opportunities brought to you by AARP Virginia. Today's program is called the Galapagos Nature's Crossroads. I'm Opal Elliott, and I'm an AARP volunteer community ambassador with AARP Virginia. So AARP is here to make your voice heard and provide information and resources on the issues that matter and to connect you with fun learning opportunities. We provide valuable educational, informational, and fun resources, things like webinars, travel interests, telethons, hauls, discounts, and more. And we began what we call Tuesday Explorers Online in earnest in the pandemic, and will continue to offer our programs virtually. I'm joined today by our technical advisor, Don Harmon, who is always there behind the scenes, making sure the Zoom ship runs smoothly. I will be monitoring the Q&A box and will facilitate the Q&A portion of our program at the end of the presentation. We ask that you use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you have. Please do not place your questions in chat. We had over 500 people sign up, and as you can see now, we've got 245 people, maybe 46, even more now. So we will be using only the Q&A to answer and to look to see what questions you have, and our presenter, Dr. Sherman, will see if he can answer those questions. We expect the program to last about 80 minutes, and we will take questions at the end of the program. We will not be using the raised hand feature today, so if you are raising your hand, we will not be able to honor that today. Please place your questions in the Q&A box. So it's indeed a pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Dan Sherman. Dan has a great love of history and nature and has taught more than 20 courses for the OLLI at George Mason University. He earned his doctorate at Cornell University and is a managing director at the American Institute for Research. Dan is an economist and has recently joined us at AARP as one of our volunteers, and we are delighted to have him. And he will be presenting sometimes in the fall our Social Security workshop in person. So please give a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Dan Sherman. Dan, the Zoom screen is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Opal. Thank you, Don. Thank you, everyone. Very happy to be here. That's a slightly outdated biography. I'm actually retired now, card-carrying member of AARP. Very happy to speak to you. And I've spoken on a lot of different topics to a lot of different groups here. And Opal, I'm seeing your picture and not mine if you want to spotlight me here, Don. But today we're going to talk about the Galapagos, and plainly, given the numbers here, there's a lot of interest in the Galapagos. I think some of you may have visited the Galapagos. Some of you hope to visit the Galapagos. It's a wonderful place to visit. But even if you don't get there, if you don't see it as a tourist destination, it is a very interesting place, very important. We tend to associate it with Charles Darwin, naturally, I went to visit. So why do we talk about the Galapagos? First, I'm going to say, I'm going to talk fairly quickly. I have a lot of material. This is actually a longer talk than I usually take a bit longer than the time we have. But it's famous, the Galapagos, again, it's a place you might want to visit, but it's famous. Why are we interested in it? It's famous for its contributions to science, and mostly because of the visit Charles Darwin made that got him thinking about what would become what we now call the theory of evolution. Other people had thought about that theory. Other people had visited the Galapagos, but Galapagos certainly associated with Darwin here. But the Galapagos, why it interested Darwin, why it interests us, why it interests scientists, it's a fairly unique place. And by studying the Galapagos, you learn a lot about geology, biology, other topics here. And when you go to the Galapagos, we tend to think, well, you visit it, you see these interesting animals. Certainly Darwin did. But you ask, why are they unique? And we'll talk about that uniqueness here. And the Galapagos in total has about 4,000 species, plants and animals there. About 40% of them are unique to the islands. They don't, even though the Galapagos is 600 miles from South America, you don't see them in the mainland of South America. You see them on the Galapagos. And in many cases, you see some of these unique species on specific islands or even specific parts of islands here too. These days, yeah, the Galapagos has a history. It was discovered more than 500 years ago, but it's very much protected. It's an international park, basically. It's now mostly preserved, but anytime you have a natural resource like the Galapagos, you ask, there's going to be a pressure for development. A lot of people want to see it. How do we preserve it? We have that many places, but it's a great place to visit. I made a visit. This is me. I don't know if you can see my image on screen or not, but I'm here. This is my partner, Michelle. We were there in 2015 with a relatively small group of individuals. Interesting, we have Texas people here. It was a group of biology teachers from Texas. A lot of animal exposures, including a bird that landed here. Where are the Galapagos? Well, they're off the coast of Ecuador, right on the equator, and you have about 20 islands total. And here are the Galapagos. You will typically fly possibly into Peru, more likely into Ecuador, and then make a flight over to the Galapagos. You might be able to get there from boat, but typically you fly there. As you travel in boat from island to island, some group of them, you're likely to cross the equator because it's a small group of islands. We'll see them in a moment, but right at the equator here. And here they are with their names, Spanish names. They originally had English names. Basically, who were some of the original settlers on the Galapagos who wanted to name the islands, except pirates, English pirates who liked to hide their boats in there, and they could go out and attack Spanish boats coming up the coasts of South America, laden with gold and silver and such. So you'll see the various islands here and some of the outer islands. And when you look at them, this picture, hopefully you can see there's some bumps here. These are volcanoes on the island. And you might see, I don't know if there's a volcano in here, but you'll see they're elevated. They're bumps. And as you move to this side of the chain of islands, you'll see bumps that happen to be volcanoes, somewhat active. How did the Galapagos, why were they formed? It's interesting to look at this, interesting geology, but it also will tell you about life on the island. Basically, the Galapagos are sitting on top of a hot spot. There is lava coming up from the earth as plates of earth go over it. Remember, tectonic plates. So what happens if you have a plate going over where one of these hot spots is, the lava comes up, you get a volcano that builds underwater, it might eventually break the ground, but as that is happening, it is slowly moving. So at some point, the volcano goes extinct as we go here, and another island is forming, and as the islands move along, they get worn. So on one side of the island, one side of the Galapagos, you have mountains, submerged mountains. They, if you had gone back some length of time, they would have been active volcanoes. They would have become islands with extinct volcanoes. Then they would have gotten worn. Then they would go under the ocean. So you'll see, here's the example of active volcano here, the volcano moving along, etc., getting a chain of islands here. And the islands move, they don't move much. It's 2.5 inches per year. So it takes about a year, 25,000 years to go a mile. But the islands, 3 million years on the far edge to the east, about 700,000 is what that should say, the newer islands, which are very rough and active volcanoes. Amazingly enough, because it's such a geologically active area, you probably have heard of hydrothermal vents. Basically, these structures in deep water with very, very hot water, boiling water coming out of them. And you have all manners of life. They don't get sun. It's almost a different biology, which you might see on other planets. You also see familiar animals, but just shows what the interest of the Galapagos is. So here are the Galapagos again. You can see the bumps on them. These are active volcanoes, and you can see the islands, the new islands, the old islands. These are fairly green, lower. These are more mountainous. This one less mountainous because it's forming. So hopefully that's clear. Just in contrast, here's another set of islands you might be familiar with, Hawaiian Islands, and they move, lava coming out of the ground, moving another direction. The oldest islands are out here, some underwater, and the newest islands still with active volcanoes, the big island of Hawaii. And there's even, evidence new islands forming, going the other way. Climate of the Galapagos, it's right on the tropics, right on the equator. It's very, very temperate. But it's an unusual place, and this is very important for it. Given where it is on the coast of South America, very cold water comes up from Antarctica. That cold water brings a lot of nutrients. It's a very good place for life to be. Plants will grow, algae and such will grow off the Galapagos. The animals that eat them will be there. Because it's temperate, you actually have penguins there, not Antarctic penguins, but penguins that can take it. So you've got the cold water, very nutrient rich coming up here. And it is a place that doesn't have heavy rain, but when you go to the Galapagos, depending on the time of year, you will see some rain. And as you get particularly to the west, it is, I wouldn't say moist, but you get a lot of plant life, a lot of animals. Tends to be cool in the summer, wet in the spring. You'll want to plan your trip around that. And I'm not going to really talk about trips to the Galapagos other than mine, but what I would say is, when you go, you should certainly know what your itinerary is, what you're likely to see, what the weather is, etc. So, here's the weather basically bouncing between 68 and 80 over the season. And you will hear about El Nino, and that really affects the Galapagos. El Nino is, of course, warm air, warm water coming across the Pacific. We'll talk about that. Has some real effects on the Galapagos too, because again, it's right, Galapagos at the crossroads. So the islands, relatively new. They're 3 million years old or less, and they're close enough to the islands. If the islands were just 50 miles off, 10 miles off, they would look very much like South America. You wouldn't get a lot of difference here. But things are far enough. If they were, 1,000 miles away or 2,000 miles away, they probably wouldn't have much of anything on them, including animals from South America. But the Galapagos has a lot of life, a lot of different animals, a lot of different plants, and those plants look a lot like what's in South America, but they look different. It's as if, beginning to get to Darwin, it's as if somehow these plants, these birds, turtles that can float on logs, other animals, made their way to the Galapagos and somehow changed, and even changed them when they went from island to island. You see that variation there too. So again, the very, very rich. If you're a bird living in the Galapagos, let's say you're a certain sort of finch, if you let a bunch of finches out on the Galapagos, well, in some places, they're going to have seeds to eat, big seeds, little seeds, hard seeds. Some of them are going to have insects, etc. There's going to be different things for them to eat. And you could imagine, again, jumping ahead, that different sorts of, in this case, birds would flourish. Tortoises that eat off of trees are going to have different necks to get to different sorts of things, etc. So really, again, you see a lot of different environments here. And here's just some pictures of the Galapagos, stolen from the internet. And, this is a lava field, fresh lava. You do have volcanoes out there. There's actually some volcanoes now that are kind of rumbling, sending out their lava. I think the last biggish explosion was in 2015, but like the Big Island of Hawaii, you can see. Here's one of my favorite sights. I was in a boat. The boat just docked. We woke up in the morning. I looked out. I came out onto the deck and saw Pinnacle Rock. Um, so before Darwin, the Galapagos, it was discovered 1535. The Bishop of Panama basically got off course, found himself and his crew in the islands. The captain wrote to the Spanish king that these islands are worthless. And he saw the far west island, which we'll see is all lava, steaming volcanoes. It was rainy season, no fresh water. He said the islands are worthless, and he thought they were essentially a vision of hell here. He didn't get to, the more eastern islands, which are lusher. But the islands show up 1562. They had the name of Galapagos, which is an old name for saddle, because people thought the tortoises looked like saddles, the shell of them. And 1600s, sanctuary for pirates, great place to, English pirates in particular. But the British were there. They named the islands. Eventually, we went back to the Spanish names. But there was, there were people who said there's some interesting animals. Relatively little settlement there. There was a jail there. People who did come to the Galapagos, 1700s, 1800s, whalers, seal hunters there too. And the British, the American came through. Herman Melville, as he was traveling the world, later he'd write Moby Dick, found himself in the Galapagos, called them the Enchanted Islands. Not necessarily because they were magical, but they were difficult to get around. Galapagos, I've already spoken to this word for tortoise here. These tortoises are important. Obviously you see them, they're very striking. And the tortoises, they can weigh 500 pounds and they go a year without water. What's surprising about that, or what maybe is depressing, is the tortoises, of course, here are the sailors, they're out in the ocean. They get to the Galapagos. If it's dry season, they can't really find water. If they're sailing away, they need to have a source of water, food. What do? They take living tortoises. And thousands of them were taken as a source of food and water. Here's a tortoise that you would see. Numbers were way down. They were captured for the oil. Their eggs were eaten, etc. 200,000 were taken. Now there's 25,000. They were between taking them and the fact that people brought goats to the Galapagos. The goats would eat everything. The tortoises didn't have much to eat. A lot of these tortoises disappeared, and some of them are extinct now. There's a very famous one. But you can see these tortoises actually will move 4 or 5 years a day. You'll see them typically when you go to the Galapagos. There's a research center in the main town. There's really only one town of any size there. You'll see the Charles Darwin Research Center. You'll see tortoises, but they typically go up into the hills here. So Darwin, who was he? Charles Darwin? Well, very well-to-do family. He was born on February 12th, 1809, the same day as Abraham Lincoln. Very, very well-to-do family. Both sides of the family, but really the mother's family, the money had come through the Wedgwood porcelain fortune here. And, what is he going to do in his life? He always had lots of money. He came from a family of physicians, except he saw blood. He saw people getting surgery without anesthesia, decided that wasn't for him, considered the ministry, and he decided that wasn't for him. But he got generally interested in natural history. And at this point, you don't really have scientists. You almost have gentlemen, and a few women too, not that many women, who study scientific topics. Typically, they're fairly well-to-do people. Some will be associated with schools. Some of them are just going to live out in the countryside doing experiments. Well, that's what Darwin was heading towards when he was a young man and what he became. His father suggested, again, he go off to university, goes to Cambridge to become a minister, but he gets really interested in science. And his interest in science is mostly geology. We think of him as a biologist, but he is always interested in rocks, their age, what you can get out of them, find in them fossils, etc. And in 1831, so here he's 22 years old, and he's kind of finishing up college, isn't clear what he's going to do. And a friend of his father gets word to the Darwins. There's a boat that's about to take off one of these journeys of explorations, a boat called the Beagle. It's going to be the second voyage. And the captain, who's an aristocratic man, wants a gentleman. he's got the sailors, but he wants someone he can have dinner with every day, have conversation with, and so forth. So basically, Darwin comes on. He's quite interested in this for the travel it's going to do and all. He comes on as a captain's assistant. He's given a cabin, but he has an interest in science, so he is going to very quickly move into that role. So his father doesn't really want him to do this, but his grandfather, Wedgwood Pottery, says, let the kid do this. The boat's supposed to go for 2 years. It goes off for 5 years and really takes an amazing trip here. The captain is Robert Fitzroy. It's amazing to realize this boat was 90 feet long. It's a very, very small boat. Darwin is very aware of this because it turns out almost as soon as the boat gets out of port, he realizes he's very, very prone to seasickness. I mean, violent seasickness. So you have a ship's surgeon, doctor, who's supposed to be collecting specimens, taking notes, but Darwin's, really doing it. He's getting the attention of the captain and all. The ship's surgeon basically gets off early in the trip. So Darwin becomes the ship's naturalist here. And the reason the boat is out there is not to support Darwin, but really it's a military trip. The South American countries, again, including Ecuador, are getting their freedom from Spain. And, Britain's a trading country, military power, wants to know what the world is out there, wants some very good maps out there. So they make this trip, again, almost 5 years. And towards the end of the trip, almost 4 years in, they stop at the Galapagos. Darwin likes nothing more than getting off the ship. So he'll get off the ship with a few others, and then the ship, and they had some other smaller boats, would really be out there charting the landscape and then creating maps. Darwin comes back from England 1839, so at this point he's about 30, and he really gets a reputation for the trip that he's made around the world. During the time, he's collecting a lot of specimens, sending them off. That's what these boats did. They'd go to port, and he would just have boxes full of specimens, and he'd write some papers. He had done research on coral reefs, others, but he writes this book, Voyage of the Beagle, and you can see the Beagle. Again, this little 90-foot boat, that was a simplified map you saw go by here. I'll show it to you again. They really made a lot of little side trips here. So there's the Beagle making its way around the world here, including its trip to the Galapagos before it went to Australia, went through the Indian Ocean, etc. here. But the Voyage of the Beagle, and here it is going through Straits of Magellan, and again, tiny little boat here compared to the cruise ships. Darwin writes his book, Voyage of the Beagle, is a classic. It's still worth reading. It's very interesting reading Darwin's impressions of what he saw. And you see hints. There's a chapter on the Galapagos of the animals he saw and some of the questions that he was beginning to raise. So here's the map that Captain Fitzroy made of the Galapagos. Looks a lot like what we saw when we started here. This map was actually used by the British well up to World War II. It was a very, very good map. He was an excellent sailor. So while he's in the Galapagos, he's traveling in South America, and he gets the idea, there are those who would say there was a flood and then very quickly all the animals that we see today came into existence. And people did have a sense of evolution, including Darwin's grandfather, that somehow or another animals were related. So a dog and a fox might be related. A blackbird and a crow. I don't know if that's a crow and a vulture. An eagle and a vulture might be related, etc. But they didn't really have a sense of how would it be possible for animals to be related, but in some sense differ. So Darwin, as he's traveling along, he sees the Earth is changing slowly, and he sees layers of sediments. He sees things building up, riverbeds building up, but then as he digs down in those riverbeds or they're dried down, he sees layers here. He sees things, he doesn't see the Grand Canyon, but he sees mountains have, things have split in earthquakes, and he just sees layers of deposited sediment with, different shells in them. The deeper down you go, you start to see animals you haven't seen before. You see bigger animals, etc. He travels up into the Andes. He sees seashells, and he's wondering, how did they get there? So he finds a lot of animals. I'll show a picture of myself, including the giant sloth. I had this picture taken at the Harvard Museum of a giant sloth, showed it to my wife, and she said, uh, which which one are you talking about? But anyway, bad joke there. So as he travels, he notices in different places, there's variation. I'll talk about animals, but also plants here. And, an animal on one side of the mountains or higher up might be a different color or be stockier or have a different nose, etc. And as he travels along, to a different environment, he sees what looks like the same, similar animal, but then something different. So Darwin is thinking, evolution is in the air. People are saying, animals change, animals, plants change over time, but how? And what he ultimately comes up with is not the theory of evolution. He didn't really use that word. He talked about transmutation, that is change by means of natural selection. And we'll talk what natural selection is. So he spends his time, he's on land, he's collecting lots of animals. And as he's on the Galapagos, it's the reason we go, there's something primal there because it's new. You have smoldering volcanoes, you have these lizards that you see nowhere else that do look like small dragons here. You see these giant tortoises that these days you'd look at them and say, oh, maybe they're out of Jurassic Park or something. But he's seeing unusual animals. That's an imaginary sketch that we just saw of Darwin. And here's one of the lizards, one of the iguanas that he would see, found no other place but the Galapagos. He looks fearsome, but he dives off the rocks, goes for algae. And again, real diversity of life, different from the mainland and different from island to island here. I'm not going to read from the Voyage of the Beagle, but basically what he does is he spends 5 years thinking about this, trying to come up with a mechanism of how things could change. And it's a long story. He's very, very slow to publish until one day in the mail, he gets a letter from a fellow named Alfred Wallace that basically has the same theory that Darwin's has written out, but hasn't put into print yet here. So Darwin writes his great book on the origin of species, 1859, but the full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle of Life. So very descriptive title here. But the key things are, he's going to talk, how do different animals become different species? Species being animals that, even though they might be similar, two types of birds, they can't reproduce together here. Natural selection, he was very familiar with man-made selection, artificial selection, just because he liked pigeon breeding or horses or dogs or, corn. We'll go in, we'll find horses of a certain type, dogs of a certain color, temperament, and we'll breed them, getting them to, certain features to be more prominent and permanent. They may still be the same species. The argument that would be that, you could get them far enough that they would change here. And so the favored races, the idea being here in the struggle for life. Darwin said he had read Thomas Malthus, the economist, that said you're always going to have a huge number, in Malthus's case, people born, but many more animals are born than are going to survive and breed. And ultimately, for the species to survive of a given type, Darwin didn't use the term survival of the fittest, but there was a struggle for resources. And for whatever reason, a litter of puppies, every puppy is a little different. Children are a bit different. If an individual has certain features that help in the struggle for survival, that individual is more likely to survive and possibly pass that on to their offspring. So through this mechanism of natural selection, you're going to get variety in life, in that variety. Darwin didn't have genetics, he didn't have DNA, he didn't really understand how that could happen. We now know fairly plainly, and best evidence for evolution, I think, is in genetics, in DNA. You see the similarities here. So Darwin will write later in his life his autobiography, Galapagos Origin of All of His Views, here. And again, he'll write about mockingbirds, he'll talk about finches. One thing that strikes him, he doesn't notice it so much at the time, he doesn't think of it, but somebody lives on the Galapagos, the vice governor, I think it is, says to him, "Oh, you just show me a tortoise shell, they're being loaded up on the boats. I can tell you exactly what island they come from, because these tortoises are similar, but on this island, they tend to be a little closer to the ground, or they have longer necks, or their mouths are different, because this one eats cactus, the other one." The idea being, what Darwin will notice is, the tortoises that survive best on a different island, or the birds that survive best with different sorts of seeds, etc., are going to be those best able to eat, survive, and pass features on here. So anyway, so he works out the idea that you will have, we now call it mutation, but you will have variation, and some features that never existed may come out. Just you'll get an animal that will be different from another, and if that mutation, if that change helps the animal survive better than other animals, that will work its way into, we would now say, the gene pool. So natural selection. So if you will, survival of the fittest, you get change over time. So he doesn't have genetics. But what he does do is he's working through the theory. This is one of his most important documents. It was actually lost, and then it was just found in a box in a library. But it's essentially, Darwin writes, "I think." And the notion of "I think" is, he is thinking, I'm seeing these different animals and there's some sort of related. I'm seeing similar animals, and maybe they had a similar ancestor. And here's another group of animals, maybe they had a similar ancestor, and so forth. So you almost get life as a tree. I think it's better to say a bush. Creatures are always developing variations in them. A lot of them are going to disappear, but some of them are going to happen. Copy of his book, it was an immediate bestseller. It was reasonably well accepted. Darwin was a very shy character. He was suffering from some would say he picked up a disease that led to his vomiting. He basically became a recluse, a gentleman living out 20 miles from London, had a good family, very good marriage, and such, wrote books on a number of topics, but he wasn't somebody who enjoyed getting into, argument, disagreements. He had other people, if you will, who helped him when it came to the theory of evolution. That was his great book. Darwin becomes the great old man of English science. And again, one of the things he looked at, and it's really a fascinating topic, he saw, these rather dull looking birds, and he sent their carcasses off to London, and basically an ornithologist said, these are different species and they really differ. And what Darwin then did, what others did, and I'm going to tell you about some research that has been done recently, the idea being that these birds developed for the islands. I'm going to show you a little bit of travelogue. So you get to the that's a lot on the Galapagos. So I traveled on a relatively small boat. You can take boats of all sizes. We'd hop onto these little boats. When you go on the Galapagos, you're not going to travel on your own. You're going to have a guide, registered guide, typically Ecuadorian. We had a wonderful guide. It was actually a Belgian guide, and Ecuadorian citizen, had married an Ecuadorian woman. That had ended, but he had stayed. He was a medical doctor. But we traveled around. I had a 10-day trip. You can go several times during the year, and depending when you go, you'll see different things. But certain things you're going to see. So here we are with the Texas biology teachers. My wife Michelle. You'll see. It looks like we're in desert here. When you're there, you'll see birds that probably the most familiar creatures you'll see are the birds, because they can fly over from the mainland. So, but there's still some animals there you don't see elsewhere. Here, so flamingos. Here, pools of flamingos, pelicans. Galapagos is great for snorkeling. It's one of the great diving areas here. Deeper diving you can do, but even if you just want to put on a mask and want to look, you'll basically see aquarium fish, because the water very, very rich. And you have fish there that don't exist elsewhere in the world. People, when you go to the Galapagos, you're going to share the sea with turtles, sea lions, sea rays. I don't know if you see stingrays and penguins. You'll see nowhere near where I would be, hammerhead sharks. Here's some of the animals that you'll see. And of course, the fish are relatively tame. They get out of the way. You have these beautiful starfish. And again, you just put on your mask, just dip down in the water and you'll see them 3 feet down here. See if I can get that one back again. You'll have the sea lions and seals. They'll just come up and play with you. They're just as curious as can be. Here, you'll see the penguins here. They're having a hard time because people have brought mosquitoes to the island and they suffer malaria. They're not used to it. They also have trouble with an El Nino session when the water is warmer. El Nino may not be related to global warming. It's a natural cycle there, but you also, do have warming too. So here's some rays. Here's a hammerhead shark. Again, hope you don't see them. You'll see seals on the beach. Animals in the Galapagos are relatively tame. I shouldn't say tame, but they're not tame, but they don't have a fear of humans. They just, by and large, haven't seen humans who are attacking them. But, he would say you could walk up to an iguana and hit it on the head with a rock or pick it up. It didn't care. You can walk up to seals on beaches. You can see birds nesting, basically looking their nest now. And when you go to the Galapagos, you can't just do that anywhere. There's only certain places you're supposed to walk. Having said that, we took a path and we were seeing motorcycle tracks going off the trees. Here is my particular guide. Here's, I believe it's a booby here. Great name here. You see the big feet here. And again, you can just walk up to these birds, and see them. Here's a hawk. Here's an owl, each unique to the Galapagos. Here's some penguins that we saw here. This is a frigate bird, which can blow its throat out. Having a fun time doing all these recollections. Here we are in, the one town in the Galapagos. The boats go in there. You can stay at a hotel and take boats out, though most people are going to, get on a 7-10 day boat here. But the seals just come up, they enjoy it. While they're here, you have to be careful. You'll walk along, you'll see iguanas here. There's actually a pretty little church in town. This is where the Charles Darwin Research Center is too. So you'll go there to see the tortoises, but it commemorates the wildlife on the Galapagos, including, you can see a penguin and a booby here. Here is an iguana, land iguana. You'll see them, large animal, looks like something out of Jurassic Park. You'll see them, we saw them up in the town in the Galapagos. I'll show you a little more on the marine iguana, the black dragon-like. Yeah, here I am. You see some of the boats out here, and you can just see the iguanas sunning themselves on here. They're cold-blooded. They have to warm in the sun. Once they get sufficiently warmed, they'll jump into the water. I'm going to show you a video of that, and they have to feed themselves and then get back before, their bodies chill or they die here too. But very, very dramatic. Here they are a little closer here, and this looks like a baby iguana here too. Kind of fearsome looking. Darwin called them imps of darkness, and what he said is the black lava rocks on the beach. These are at the far west, the volcanic islands. They're frequented by large 2 to 3 foot disgusting, clumsy lizards. They are as black as the porous rocks over which they crawl and seek their prey from the sea. I call them imps of darkness here. And they will dive. They can spend 30 minutes underwater, and then, assuming they make it out, and most of them do, they will warm up here. So, and they spray salt from their nose too. So it's very unique. Here's a little documentary. I'm going to show you a little bit. I said we have a lot to cover.
At dawn, the cold-blooded iguanas thaw from the night's chill, absorbing the heat of the equatorial sun. When they've warmed, the coastline of Fernandina comes alive. On this island, food is scarce. And the only way to find it involves a mission that seems suicidal. Only the larger adults dare to take the plunge. Marine iguanas are strong swimmers. With a single breath, they can comfortably dive to 30 feet. And all this effort for red and green algae, which thrive in the cold water. Marine iguanas are the world's only sea lizards. But when their distant ancestors were washed ashore in Galapagos, they were land animals. To survive, they were forced to tackle the ocean. This male must graze as quickly as he can. In these chilling waters, his body temperature falls fast. A 10-minute dive is about the most he can manage before his muscles seize up. Fighting the surge back to the shore is a Herculean task. And to make matters worse, he must now run the gauntlet of sea lions. They're the last thing the iguana needs. No harm is meant. It's nothing more than a rather one-sided game of cat and mouse.
I think you can see amazing animals. You consider the struggle for life or why it would pay to be, a bigger, stronger iguana, one that could hold your breath, etc. It's amazing to see these. You can see them when you go, even snorkeling. You'll see them swim by you. Of course, there they are eating the algae. Now, if the water temperature, warms up and the algae drop down, these animals don't do well, and that will happen with warming. You'll see seals on the beach.
A male.
Say much about them. I like to say Fred and Ginger. I do a lot of theater talks. You'll see these boobies that just do this wonderful dancing, very common birds. Maybe we'll see.
Blue-footed boobies also dance to form partnerships. Each movement mirrors the other. Like flamingos, they seem to fall for birds like themselves. Compatible.
Sounds a little bit like Once in Love with Amy, Frank Lesser. The one thing I'll say on this, Darwin wrote extensively, about how animals might change one into another, what the pressures would be, but even within time, how, there'd be certain features that animals, we essentially would choose a mate to find mates that would have features that would lead to offspring that were more lively. In this case, if you're a blue-footed booby and you have good nutrition, you're going to have very bright blue feet versus one blue, doesn't eat as well. These boobies, they're very awkward on land. They're famous for landing and falling over, but boy, can they dive. And I actually got a picture of my little camera of them diving. So lots to see. El Nino, we're talking about this is, well, currents go both ways, but an El Nino is essentially when warm water comes this way. It actually affects the United States here. But again, we're talking about water flows that are very close to the equator. So when colder water goes under further down the Galapagos, it's not getting that cold water it would from this direction here. And when warm water is on the top, the cold water that comes in from the south is getting pushed under. So in this case, you could think the lizards aren't getting the algae that they would like, etc. So the temperature warms up, the plants dry. It's, certain plants and the birds that will eat them will have a difficult time. Well, the birds that can survive that will do better, etc., etc. Tourists in Galapagos, it's an important issue. Again, I'm kind of skipping around because our time is short here. But yeah, the Galapagos have a fascinating place. People haven't really lived there. It's been very, very small groups. People came, they essentially farmed it. And they took out whatever land they wanted. They let the goats run, etc. They'd have cattle there, etc. Well, that sort of farming has been banned. Plenty of feral species there. They've done the best to get rid of them. But what you do have happening on the islands is tourists. And here's a map up through 2021. The numbers actually are now higher. This is the pandemic coming in here. But even in 1990, the Galapagos were getting 50,000 people a year. Weren't getting 100,000 people until, let's say 2004 or so. But then that went up to 200,000 people, and it's hit 300,000 people. And people want to see the Galapagos, and there's that tension. How many people do you have come into the islands? Because people, when they come into the islands, are basically going to be coming in boats, but that, who's going to be on those boats? It's going to be Ecuadorians who tend to live on the islands. So you're putting that pressure plus whatever, processing it takes for, people to have food, water, etc. on those boats. So you can see the tourist numbers going up, and this is an old picture, but the tourist numbers have been going up. Well, the population numbers are going up from just like 1,000 people in 1950 to 2005, whenever this is 20,000. I'm sure has, gone up with the tourists. You can see they go together. So the question of preserving the Galapagos, everybody wants to see it, as they should. It's such an important place, a fascinating place. How does that happen? Well, in 1935, Ecuador, the 100th anniversary of Darwin's visit, passed a law that was going to protect wildlife. Though there wasn't much enforcement there. And again, there weren't a lot of tourists. Supposedly it was going to cut down on the farming and such here. But in 1959, the 100th anniversary of the origin of species, Galapagos became a national park, and 97% of it essentially became protected land. And the Ecuadorians, they have a very rich country in terms of wildlife. There's just a lot of different terrains, jungle, mountains, etc. They're proud of their wildlife, and like other countries, in some ways, I'd like to have more people visit, but at the same time, they can't have so many people visit. They can't develop in a way that they essentially kill off their golden egg here. So 1960, you really start getting tourism. Before that time, it would be scientists and relatively few people here. Marjorie Merriweather Post went there on the Sea Cloud. And you saw tourism increasing here. It's one of the first World Heritage Sites, one of the UN World Heritage Sites, and then it became a marine reserve in 2001. It's on the top of everybody's list to preserve. But there's certainly concerns. Fishing boats come in and around it. There's pollution that blows in from the shore. Boats dump oil. They're not supposed to, etc. And, again, there is development to support that tourism. One of the earliest proponents of developing the islands or protecting the islands was Franklin Roosevelt, who had a great record in conservation, and he came through the Galapagos in 1938. It's going to become a Navy base in the war. I'm not sure I mentioned that, but when you fly in, you come to the island of Baltra, and that was after Pearl Harbor, we wanted the United States wanted a place to place Navy boats that could help protect it from anything that might be coming in from the Pacific, including the direction of Australia. Too. So the Galapagos developed a military base at that time, and that later became the Air Force, the base that you're going to come through when you fly into the Galapagos. But Roosevelt was down there for a good fishing trip. Remember, he was a Navy man here, and after the war, what should happen? In 1944, Roosevelt was thinking about this. He wrote to the Secretary of State. These islands represent the oldest form of animal life. He knew there was something special about them and should therefore be preserved for all time as some sort of international park. And Halden mentioned that. But what did he say? He said, I would die happy if the State Department could accomplish something on it. So interesting to see that. So why do we need preservation? Well, I give you what I call Exhibit A. Here's a turtle. Well, this tortoise is watching its food being eaten up by hungry goats. The best known tortoise here, we're getting near the end here, is Lonesome George. And he was a tortoise who was found on the Isle of Pinta, different from other tortoises. He has a different shell, different neck shape. So he and his can get to other, get to the vegetation that lives there, and different feet for climbing, etc. And with him, they were hoping to find a female tortoise he could breed with. He was close to 100 years old, and there were some other species of tortoises they thought he might be able to breed with. The genes were fairly close, and that's the idea of mutations, that at some point the DNA just gets close, but not close enough that you can breed. So like you'll hear we have 99% of our DNA in common with chimpanzees or whatever. You can get a good overlap of genetic material, but ultimately you won't be able to have fertile offspring. But here is Lonesome George and a story of what happened to him. He became the great icon. You'd go to the Darwin Center, you would see him, and until he died.
Lonesome George, the giant tortoise, caught people's attention when he was first brought out of the wild and into captivity. People were sad that he was the only member of his species. As a scientific community,
This was put together by the Museum of Natural History, by the way, up in New York.
I hoped that there was more time with him as we were thinking about other ways to try to get him to produce offspring. He never really found much interest in the females that were brought in to be attractive to him. He had a relationship with the individuals who took care of him over decades in the Tortoise Breeding Center on Santa Cruz in the Galapagos. And when he died in June of 2012, they were devastated. The American Museum of Natural History was chosen by the Galapagos and by the government of Ecuador to prepare this individual specimen because we're world-renowned in our taxidermy and our ability to create amazing lifelike forms.
The difference between
So anyway, here's Lonesome George, his shell, his hard parts being preserved, and you can see them if you go to Ecuador. Do you keep them in the Ecuadorian museum, their natural history museum in Quito, or do you have them out in on the Galapagos itself? And the decision was to have them out on the Galapagos. Hopefully people will remember.
I think he...
Very, very famous tortoise. So, and kind of a sad story of what can happen. There's a good website. I want to kind of keep this to an hour here. Is the Galapagos Conservancy. And that is actually local. They maintain the big research center there with the government of Ecuador here. A lot of good information. This is a good place to get your pencils out, though this talk will be recorded, will be available here. So if you go to Galapagos.org, you can just, They will tell you a lot of the history of the Galapagos, and of course they'll accept your donations too. They do a lot of good work down there too. If you're thinking of going on the Galapagos cruise, I don't really have a lot of advice. I took my tour 10 years ago. There's lots of boats out there. You know, I would think it's like anything else. Do your research and, you know, ask the question, what sort of creature comforts do you need to travel comfortably? How much physical exercise will you be doing? You know, you have to be able to jump out of a boat, do, you know, a fair amount of hiking, climb up rocks, etc. The tours should be able to tell you that. And of course, the cost and what are you going to see? I think there's a certain amount of old favorites. Everybody will go to this Darwin, to the research center. They'll make their way out to Fernandina to see the Imps of Darkness. You'll see some volcano cones. You know, it's just really a wonderful place to visit. I love the small boat. The crew, you know, is probably, if there were 15 of us, there were, you know, fewer than 10 crew. A couple we didn't see much of, but yeah, the cook, the captain, the vice assistant captain, just really wonderful hosts here too. Some other books I like to recommend. There's a nice series, I don't know if you can see it on YouTube, but if you just do a little bit of YouTubing, you're going to find a lot of good information on the Galapagos. The Islands That Changed the World, a very good book by Paul Stewart. The Galapagos, you'll see this. There's books, this is more of a textbook, Understanding the Galapagos. Very readable book. Again, you'll get these, I can send this to AARP, and I might just send an email and maybe they can figure out how to send it out to you here. But this book, relatively short, The Galapagos, just gives you a nice history. It tells you what's unique about the Galapagos, how they were formed, what Darwin did, where they are now, what some of the animal stories here. Fascinating book, Diana Preston. She's one of my favorite authors here, wrote a book, The Evolution of Charles Darwin. There's a lot of books here. And again, if you remember who Darwin was, he was this, you know, well-to-do, I wouldn't call him ne'er-do-well, but what's he going to do in life here? And he happened to get onto the Beagle, and he just spent years very cautiously coming up with this theory of evolution that probably is more controversial today than it was in the day for some reasons. But it's a very, very good book. One of the best things I've read about Darwin and his efforts here. There's a book I want to recommend, and there's a movie. A little torn. I'd love to show you the movie, but I want to leave some time for questions. This is a book that won a Pulitzer Prize back in 1995. I'm going to tell you how to get it here. And it's a really fascinating story. It's, you know, begins, boy, I'm trying to think of what the date would be, probably in the late 60s, early 70s. Two relatively young researchers go to a remote island or a completely uninhabited small island in the Galapagos, and they start studying those famous finches of Darwin's, because there's a number of different species of finches on the islands here. And they just take incredibly careful measurements of these little birds that don't seem all that different, but they have, you know, some have longer beaks, some have stronger beaks, some have thicker, wider beaks, some have longer legs, some are better at, you know, hopping on the ground, some can barely get out of a tree, some can eat insects, etc. And they watch them, and the idea is they're watching them not just for one season to see what the variety is, that's how they start out, but then they start to see, they're at a time when there's a lot of weather changes. And 90% of some of these birds die off of certain species, and others come, and those that survive within, if 90% of, you know, one bird species dies off, what's left? The ones that are more, you know, adapted to them. And they just see real changes, you know, in the bird population on the island, within the species. And essentially what's happening there over the space of 40 years, they're close to retired. They are retired now. They've written quite a bit of work, quite a bit here. But they're seeing evolution working. Darwin thought it was tens of thousands of years for animals to change into each other. They're seeing evidence, you know, 10, 15, 20 years that now you have some animals, partly because of physical size, partly because their songs don't attract one another, don't breed, you know, aren't breeding, and, possibly couldn't breed, that essentially that, if you will, that tree of life is breaking out. It's absolutely fascinating. Here's the island they work on. You can only imagine, living here, but it does get greener during the course of the year. So I'm going to give you a final thought from Darwin himself. And when we look at what Darwin did he's a great naturalist. He loved nature. He was curious, nature being the rocks he saw. He did a lot of work with plants, animals. He was a curious person who had an incredible sense of observation. And as he's working through what he called this mystery, how did creatures, animals, plants and animals, how is it that we have this variety? What's the mechanism from which we have all of this life? Why is it, life almost seems magical. We have animals like the black iguanas, marine iguanas, that can live at that edge. I'm sure if he had known of the hydrothermal vents that, you get these bizarre animals that even have a different biochemistry, can live off of sulfur compounds, can live in temperatures that would kill bacteria, that can kill other bacteria. He would be fascinated by this. But when he ends his great book, The Origin of Species, this is what he ends with. And I just think it's a great thought to keep in mind. So he goes through this long theory talking about the variety of life, raising a lot of questions, giving us his theory. But then he ends with, there is a grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. He didn't know. And that whilst this planet has gone on cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, and this is the phrase I love, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That, however it happened, we started out simply, we now have this wonderful world of plants and animals. They're changing and presumably will continue to change. So I am going to stop by showing you this picture of a couple of lizards. I really like them. And I'm not going to show you the movie that goes with this, but the bonus that you can get, it takes about 15 minutes to see, is if you Google, and write this down, everyone, Beak of the Finch video, and you'll get to this video. Opal, if you don't mind, I'm just going to show 1 minute of it, and then we can take questions. So here we are down in the Galapagos. I just want to show you the people.
To seek insights into that question, researchers are focusing on places where species recently arose, such as the remote Galapagos Islands.
Scientists are making observations and conducting experiments that would have surprised Charles Darwin. And they're discovering new insights into what the great naturalist called the mystery of mysteries: how new species form.
The Galapagos Islands are one of the most spectacular landscapes in.
So you'll see this, and here's the hero of our story.
Biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant have been seeking answers to how species arise by focusing on one of the smaller islands called Daphne Major.
When we started out, we had no plan for the long term. In fact, we thought it was just going to be just a few years, maybe 2 years.
2 years have turned into a 40-year odyssey.
Well, there they are. It's an absolutely fascinating story of, how they went down there, how they did this research project, how they continued it into the 70s and 80s, how it's still being continued, and what they really found. And Darwin, I think, would be thrilled, if not surprised, to see how quickly animals adapt to the environment, and how, again, it almost looks like there's new species showing up in as little as 50 years. So you can only imagine, the much longer period. So I will stop with that.
And we have a number of questions that we'd like to get to, and probably maybe about 10 or 12 minutes. So
Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed first before. Hopefully they're
first,
not bad questions.
well, we're getting a lot of people who are having to sign off, but are saying what a wonderful presentation, how well done it was, how much they loved it. So I'm sure we're going to have you back. But let's go straight to the questions and see how many of them we can get
Yeah.
through before we have to sign off. So the first
Opal, pardon me,
yes,
if you don't mind, could I just go through them and I can tell which ones I can't answer and maybe I can consolidate them?
you see the questions?
Yeah, no, I've got them here. So,
Go right ahead.
yep, they do have a mailbox there. You can, get your Galapagos mailbox, send it out. There are islands you can't visit or they're very, very limited. Here, for example, the islands, that island that those scientists, you and I can't go there. They can't. Let's see, it's a question when you visit the island, it's a question about the variation. Do you see that? Will they talk about evolution? And they absolutely will. Will be the guide. Someone said we can't see Dan speaking, so sorry about that. What time of year did I visit? I went down there. It was July, August. I matched it up with a trip to Machu Picchu. Just had a very good travel company. Both of them were absolutely wonderful. I mean, there's a wet season, a dry season in the Galapagos, and you'll see different animals at different times. And, depending what you go down there for, particularly if you went diving, etc. Someone asked the question if I wanted to see babies, or what time would you want to go? Well, you'll see the baby birds in August, at least that's what I did, the boobies. But again, this is something where you do your research. And again, I think the Galapagos Conservancy is good, and your tour company should be able to tell you a lot. The question is, how did turtles survive without water for a year? Did they get it from vegetation? Well, I don't know. Apparently a turtle, has a pretty slow metabolism. If you cut into a nice juice, a 400-pound turtle, they, how can camels go a long time with water? They store it. They have watery tissues. They don't have metabolism. You can slice into the turtle, to get some meat. It's going to be wet. And I don't know if they have water storage inside of them or not, just for buoyancy. But yeah, a living turtle, don't try it at home. Will give you a supply of meat and water for a period of time. How do we know about movement of the islands? Easiest way to get to that is putting on my geologist hat. Satellites. Satellites can, GPS can get me down to the couple of inches, and we get just incredibly precise measurements now. So that would be it here. What type of penguins are those? They look like Magellanic penguins. They're actually, which you'll see off the coast of Africa, South Africa and up the coast there. But those are Galapagos penguins. They're unique to the Galapagos. From what height did the Galapagos dive into the sea? I spent about 7 or 8 days. It was a wonderful trip. Somebody asked how long was I there. The iguanas do a little bit of research, but if I remember, they're jumping a good distance. It's tough to be an iguana. They're not just going in for the stroll to get their algae. They are jumping into surging seas, waves splashing around them. Then, of course, worrying about the water to being too cold. And, as you saw, I'm not sure that one iguana made it, but being harassed by rather playful seals. There will be a recording link here. You can't see Lonesome George. I'm not sure why the person couldn't see him here. And who has control over the number of tourists to visit to keep these numbers low? Government of Ecuador here. And as I said, do they want these? It's great revenue for them. And I mean, they're having some political problems now. I don't really know the detail, but my understanding, I talked with somebody who went down there, gave this talk in February, went down there and said, no, you'll have no trouble, in the Galapagos. But what's coming up for next session? I'm not sure. I'm doing a talk. I don't know what I'm doing for AARP. For the LLI group, I'm going to be doing my talk on Oppenheimer, somewhat science, etc. How conscientious was Darwin that his theory of evolution would conflict with church doctrine of creation? He knew it. I mean, this is where we can have a longish discussion. He said he saw no need for God, particularly after his daughter, 10-year-old daughter, died. He basically stopped going to church. He just wasn't even sure he wanted to be buried in the churchyard. As it is, given his prominence, he was buried in Westminster Abbey here. A lot of again, maybe touching a nerve here. I think he had trouble with, he said, we don't know how life evolved, but he at the same time did not believe what people did at that time, creationists, that, all animals were created at the same time in their present form. There were some, very literalists, the notion would be, I give the example, Noah's Ark. The 8 or 9 people on Noah's Ark had all the animals that would ever exist, that we currently see 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, including all those variations of tortoise on the islands. So Darwin, the church actually did not have that much problem with Darwin at the time. It was, or even in Europe, it's actually, frankly, more of an American thing. But that's a, deep and contentious topic. Don't necessarily want to get into it. But he was reluctant to publish. Darwin was a very cautious individual. He knew his theory would be controversial here because, again, there were people who were thinking the Earth was young, it didn't change, it was created, with all animals, etc. So he wanted, for all of the work he did, be it the theory of evolution or otherwise, wanted the best evidence. He basically was forced to write his Origin of Species book, which is a 400-page book, because Alfred Russel Wallace had said, I've discovered the same theory. Darwin was very generous, said, let Wallace send his letter out and I'll write up a draft of what I've done. He had previously written a draft and we'll send it out. It actually didn't get much attention. But then Darwin wrote his book, his 400-page book. And he said, I would have written a much longer book in many more years if only I'd had the time. But in that particular book, The Origin of Species, he did not want to talk about the possibility that, and this is, I think, Darwin's most dangerous idea, that humans were somehow distinct from other creatures. And he did specifically write the book, on the descent of man. For a number of reasons, it's not as good a book as the other one. It's not as well argued here. But he knew that was going to be a contentious topic, that humans somehow had evolved from other apes too. And anyway, we can discuss that, what the evidence is or is not here. The Wallace line and the species there. Do I know much about the Wallace line and the species there? That's a line. Wallace was an interesting individual, and I'll wrap up with this, Opal, or answer any other questions. Is, Darwin, what's beautiful about the theory of evolution, or most theories, you can argue, is it, how well does it work? Does it explain things or not? But it is able to make predictions of how animals are going to, differ depending on how dispersed they are, how different the climates are, how animals from one distance to another will differ, how they, will differ as they're separated. And the Wallace line is, Wallace was an interesting, unlike Darwin, was a relatively poor individual who went out, traveled in South America, and then really traveled around Indonesia to examine the wildlife there. Came up with some of the same ideas as Darwin, but basically supported himself by sending animal skins and such back to England. And the Wallace line is a line between Indonesia in Australia, where the animals are very different. And that's like one thing that's very striking. Australia and New Zealand are separated from other continents. They have absolutely unique wildlife. New Zealand in particular, flightless birds. There are no mammals, native mammals on New Zealand. So I think what's fascinating about this talk is, anyway, let me wrap up with this, is you might want to answer the questions. You might want to get down to the Galapagos. It's an interesting place, but if you don't, learn about it. Look for this documentary. You talk about lifelong learners, and these truly were lifelong learners. The Grants, who, as graduate students or as new professors, went down to the Galapagos and just did amazing work over 40 years, well into their 80s. That really is such good science, but there's such good history, good science, so many insights into the world around us, the geology, the wildlife. I think the Galapagos is a great topic. So I've tried to do it justice in an hour and 15 minutes.
Well, you certainly did, Dan. If you could see all the comments that came into the chat about
Thank
how
you.
interesting they found this presentation and how grateful they were that you took the time to present it.
Oh, I
Uh,
love presenting. Great stuff.
yes, and there will be a survey that will come out. Don just put that information in the chat. Please take that survey for us, and you'll also get a link in a few days with the recording of the entire presentation. On behalf of AARP, Dan, we are really, really grateful that you were able to be our guest presenter today
Thank
and
you.
just share your valuable time and knowledge with us about the great Galapagos. I was reminded as I was listening to your talk today of my days at college and how I took this elective course on a whim called anthropology, and it was the greatest class I ever took in eons after graduating, many, many years. I ran into one of my professors and I told her how I still remember the Yanomamo and the being Indian and Huyeapan, and she said it warmed her heart. So it's wonderful to know that we just have this rich world with wonderful places to visit and people. And as the Yanomamo word, and so the Indians in Huyeapan, we hope that human civilization and tourism won't spoil the beautiful Galapagos Islands. So we love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs in the chat box. You will see a link to a survey. Please click on the link and take a few minutes to share your feedback with us. We'll also send out that link, as I mentioned earlier. And just to say one more thing, I'm ready for the journey. Are you? Thank you again, Dr. Sherman.
And Opal, I would just one more time, people, if you haven't done it, write down Beak of the Finch, that video, that 15 minutes. You'll find it fascinating.
Yes, we put that in the chat,
Thank
in the Q&A section and in the chat. Well, thank you again. We did have a couple more questions, but we're really out of time. Let's see, what time do we have now? It's about 4:17. We needed to end. We have one more question. Would you like to take that question, Dan?
If I can answer it.
It wasn't the big reason of Darwin's theories that they were so important because of the same species varied according to where they live. When you visited, did you get shown about the theory in person or see different animals and how they varied? I
Yeah,
think
I didn't answer that very well. What's interesting about this is what Darwin posited and what you would see. You certainly see it with the birds, that it's the separation of animals that, really leads to their changes. And what Darwin noticed, he's in the Falkland Islands, he's off of the coast of South America, the other side of it, the European side. There's two types of foxes, very different foxes. They're similar, but they're not, because one is on one side of the mountain, one is on the other. So it's when things separate out. But with birds, what this couple was finding is, there are some very similar birds, but the ones that are a little higher up on the mountain are the ones that are lower, or the ones that live in have feet for living in trees versus down on the ground. You just have to get some separation where there's an advantage to whatever environment you're in, be it 3 feet off the ground, be it on the other side of the mountain, or be it 50 feet across the water, you do better than the other one. And there'll be a push for natural selection towards certain features, and ultimately perhaps breaking out into species. Darwin didn't know how, we now don't know how.
Well, Dan, I'd like to end with this one quote from someone that put it in the chat. I may never ever get there in person, but this feels as if I am as close as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
We look forward to seeing you at future Tuesday Explorers. We run them from January through April. We had to squeeze this one in, and how wonderful it was that we got this one in early May. Take care. Have a wonderful day, and happy touring. Bye-bye.
Thanks.